Welcome guys to the worst tanks tier for tier in World of Tanks console, and today we will be looking from tier 5 all the way up to tier 10, and hopefully that will give you a good indication as to which tanks to avoid, which tech trees to personally avoid on your journey of learning World of Tanks console, and potentially just in terms of not trying to lose your win rate to some of these terrible tanks. And the first one being in the background here, the IKV-130, and this is a tank that I was quite surprised as being one of the worst. And that is because this tank in general is a pretty solid one. It is a tank destroyer that has a very nice top gun, and that is the 105mm 300 alpha damage gun with 120mm of standard penetration, 140mm of premium penetration, and that makes it kind of one of the derp guns down at tier 5, and it means that this tank is quite surprising in my personal opinion, considering that it also gets great camo and it also gets good concealment as well, and so you can be a little sneaky rat. And I'm sure we've done a video on this tank before recently where we showcased exactly that. However, for the majority of players, this tank is probably not the easiest to play, and that's why it has a 47.6% win rate and is the worst tier for tier or tier 5 tank in World of Tanks console. So let me know whether this should be actually the worst, or do you think that there are plenty of other tier 5s that are worse than this, as I'm sure many of you have played through a lot of bad tier 5s. Now then, the tier 6 worst in the game shares the exact same win rate percentage as the previous tank. This has 47.6% win rate, and I can see why. This tank is not particularly too easy to get into. It's kind of the first of the tank line that really has this glass cannon feature whereby if you get hit, you're getting penned no matter what happens. And it also is not particularly the most flexible tank, and it really requires you to know some of the key spots on the map in World of Tanks console for you to really make this tank work. Now, why is this tank so bad? Well, you can see here it genuinely gets like 10mm of armor on the tank, which is the same as all of the kind of glass cannon German tank destroyers, and yeah, not particularly the nicest to play, I can grant you that. And that, however, shouldn't be hindered by the fact that this thing gets an amazing gun. If you've played the Nashorn, you'll know exactly that this tank can be super deadly if you're coming up against it. It has 240 alpha on the top gun. It reloads super quick in about 6 seconds to be able to do 240, which means for a tier 6 you have 2400 DPM base on this tank, which means it is super dangerous to be sat in front of this thing. And because of the camo value of this tank, it can be really used to great effect. Now, that's not necessarily what's going to happen when you play the Nashorn, but you should definitely take it into account when thinking about playing this. Now, that's not the only thing you should be thinking about when playing the Nashorn line. You should also be thinking about the next vehicle, which is also on the worst tanks win rate in the game, and that is the Sturer Emil, the tier 7 that has a pretty chunky gun, and you can actually see it here as we upgrade the tank since I've just repurchased this one, and hopefully that'll give you a good indication as to whether or not I think it's any good. Like, I'm not going to lie, this tank is not particularly the most easy tank to get along with. It has no choice of loading premium ammunition, so if you're not able to pen anything from the front using your standard rounds, you can't just press A to win with this one. However, you can press A and have HE rounds that have 630 alpha damage within World of Tanks, which means that if you're coming up against the light tanks, if you're coming up against other Sturer Emils, you'll be able to use this to great effect. And I really do think that this tank is a little bit underrated, but I definitely think I can see why the win rate percentage is 47.25% within World of Tanks, bringing it about 1.5% under the average win rate of just under 49/ between 48%. So yeah, an interesting tank to see in the game, but I don't think I'm that surprised as it being one of the lowest, since it's super inflexible. It has really, really amazing gun depression, like genuinely the best in the game nearly. It's got 15 degrees of gun depression. You don't have any elevation. In fact, you have less elevation than depression in this one. So yeah, it's quite an interesting one. Maybe you'll get depression playing this one, but yeah, it's down to you as to whether I think you'll enjoy this one. And of course, one of the key upgrades that you will need in this tank is the engine, because without it, it feels terrible. It genuinely feels terrible, and maybe that's why this tank is just so bad, because even me as a player that's played a lot of games finds this thing a chore to play in some situations. But yeah, we'll definitely be giving a full rundown of this vehicle in a video coming fairly soon on the channel, probably next week or the week after, and we'll give this a proper good old go, considering that 490 alpha damage that this thing gets at tier 7. Now, there are plenty of tier 8s as well within the game that can be pretty bad. However, the video is only on the worst one, and that is the HMH ISU-130, and this actually comes in at the lowest win rate so far in this video at 46.82%, making this the worst one so far. And I guess I can see why, but I was a little bit surprised that this in particular has the worst win rate, considering the fact that it gets 570 alpha damage with the premium penetration rounds. Albeit that the premium penetration rounds get less penetration, but of course they do more damage. You get an extra 80, and that's because they're kind of like the British HESH rounds, but they're kind of a more intuitive way of being able to get more penetration but also more damage, but you don't get as much of a kind of damage buff with these rounds as you would on the British HESH. Yeah, it's kind of a little bit of a mix and match, but even if you do want to fire normal HE, you'll get even more damage than the 570, so you get up to 640 alpha damage with this tank, which means this has one of the nicest damage per minute for tier 8. You actually reload in 8.71 seconds with this thing, and that means that you can dish out, if you're using the premium like 212mm rounds that deal 570 alpha, which is probably more than enough to go through the majority of tier 10s that you come up against if you aim correctly, then at tier 8 you can definitely use these rounds really easily and pen like 99% of things through the front as well, like pretty easily. And that means that the DPM, if you use those 212mm rounds, the premium rounds, will be about 4,500 DPM, which is crazy for a tier 8 tank destroyer. And we'll definitely do a full review of this. That's why I've got it in the garage, and we'll give it a full go and see if this thing really lives up to its name of being the worst tank, or whether it's actually a pretty decent one. Yeah, I hope to see your guys' comments in the comment section down below as to whether or not you think that this one is bad, or whether you've played a tier 8 that you think is just 10 times worse, because I definitely think there's some other tanks that I feel are worse, and one of them being the Stark STRV S1 here, but maybe that's just because I haven't got the hang of the Swedish tank destroyer mechanic, or maybe I just find them too boring to play. But nonetheless, the HMH ISU-130 at the lowest win rate so far. Now, I definitely feel bad for the German connoisseurs of you out there, and that is because the tier 9 worst in game is actually the worst in game in terms of the win rate so far, and that's with a 46.24% win rate overall as a tank in World of Tanks console, and that makes this genuinely the worst tank in the game statistically. And that is because this thing has basically armor supposedly that is able to bounce rounds, but if you actually bounce around in this thing, I don't even know. Most things just load premium at you, which means they pen you every single time. You get 1 degree of gun depression with this tank. Yes, 1 degree. It's terrible. Once again, you've got a massive reload. Yes, you have like a big derp gun, but I don't think I'd ever really want to use the derp gun with the 95mm of penetration, and you'd probably be doing 780 damage more consistently if you use this tank, which I'd recommend. But even if you got 1 shot of damage every game, you wouldn't be far off of the average damage that people do in this tank of 967 damage on average in this thing, which is even like, for example, just as a comparison, it's half that of the STRV 103-0, the Swedish tank destroyer. So yeah, it's super low for this tank, and I'm not surprised at all, and I'm sure many of you won't be surprised at all to see this on the list, and not even that, actually the lowest on the list. Yeah, I think that this is pretty terrible, although it does set you up for the tier 10, which is also pretty terrible as well. Although this did get slight buffs, they didn't buff the gun depression, which is probably one of the biggest impacts of this, because if you are not literally looking down on your opponent, you pretty much have no chance at actually hitting them. So yeah, what a weird design. Coming in at tier 10, we have the 47.06% win rate tank, the XM551 Sheridan. The Sheridan, one of the more kind of famous tanks of World War II / Cold War era in real life. Not Cold War in the game, but you know what it is. Anyway, regardless, this thing is the light tank that it has the derp gun. You can put the 152mm on this thing, I believe. Yep, the 910 alpha damage gun that is, to all intents and purposes, pretty terrible if you want to be competitive. But you do also have the 390mm or 390 alpha 105mm cannon that this thing has, with really good accuracy, good aim time. But the thing is with this tank, it's as a light tank, it's not super quick, it's not super nimble, which kind of counteracts the whole fact of being a light tank. It's massive, which means that you get hit all of the time in this thing, albeit, you know, this tank is, it's kind of a bit of a troll. Some of the spaced armor on the sides that you get can definitely absorb a lot of rounds. I've played in the FE 4005 so many times against the Sheridan, and somehow you bounce off of the side, even though it literally has no reason that you would ever bounce off of the side. But, you know, Sheridan things. Nonetheless, a very interesting tank to play. We'll do a full review of this tank sometime soon, but I want to make sure that I do get the derp gun on this thing to really give it one replay without the derp gun, one replay with the derp gun, and that will make more of a big, like, kind of review thing of the Sheridan itself. So stick around for that. But of course, I really hope that you give your own opinions as to what you think the worst tier 10 in the game is, because it's pretty close between this, the Panzerwagen, and the FE 4005 Stage 2, albeit I don't think that that tank is necessarily that bad. But yeah, let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of all of these tier 10s, and of course, if you want to let the guys in the comment section know what your worst tier 3 and 4 tanks are in the game, then let them know. I didn't review them in this because I just feel like most people just skip ahead anyway of tier 3 and 4. So yeah, let me know in the comment section down below. And of course, don't forget, you can actually check out some of other top 5 guides that showcase both the worst tanks in the game, the best tanks in the game, and we did one recently on the worst tier 10 tanks in the game by win rate and what those were. So yeah, check out that video, and hopefully you enjoyed this one, and I hope that I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.